Hello, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. I'm Robin Dunbar. I'm the Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning and Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education. And it is a great pleasure to welcome you here to the kickoff event for this year's award-winning Teachers on Teaching series. And before we actually get into introducing today's speaker, I will put the other talk on your radar. In just a couple of weeks, November 21st, Professor Gabriel Garcia will be talking to us on Crossing El Camino Real, Community as Text for the Health Professions. So we hope we'll see you all for that event as well. And let's get into today. It's a great pleasure as well to introduce Professor Lynn Hildemann. Lynn is a professor of civil and environmental engineering. She also holds academic appointments in the Woods Institute for the Environment and BioX, and is a past fellow at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. And as diverse as these appointments seem, they are anchored in a long research record in the study of indoor air pollutants and allergens on wide-ranging topics, things like multi-unit homes and secondhand smoke, on literally deadly stoves and the use of stoves in developing countries. But it goes on beyond this. When I looked, and one of the things that really struck me was the remarkable range of questions that Lynn has set to pose and answer over her career, and the wide diversity of journals in which you'll see her work and that of her students published. It ranges from detailed chemistry, and I have to read this one, photocatalytic oxidation of gaseous formaldehyde, to modeling. What are the pathways? What are the concentrations of these pollutants and allergens? And at the complete other end of the spectrum, to policy and social issues. Why don't people who are using deadly stoves and who have affordable alternatives that are healthy, why don't these people change and replace those stoves? So just a huge area span of impact and a prolific research record starting early in her career as a student at Caltech. And in fact, Lynn got all three of her degrees at Caltech as well, and continued into an early career with great success, marked by not one, but three early career investigator awards. The very prestigious Presidential Young Investigator Award, the Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award, and the American Association for Aerosol Research Whitby Award, all recognizing promise and great impact in early career. That's continued throughout her career. As I say, the numbers of publications are prolific. The areas of impact are very, very broad. But today I actually want to focus us on another area of great relevance and impact, and that is her recognition as an excellent teacher, an award-winning teacher, most notably and most recent, the 2013 Walter J. Gores Award, which is Stanford's highest recognition for excellence in teaching. And sure enough, when you look at the citations in Lynn's Gores materials, all the things that get published and why she was nominated and awarded, you will see the words excellent and excellence throughout. But what strikes me, and I think strikes most of us in the room, those words are hard to get to, and they come through a path of other behaviors. We're not excellent by fiat, and we're not excellent without thinking about what that means. I was really struck as I looked through the citations by the language that I think makes for excellence in teaching. Words like generosity, phrases like always working to improve, creatively redesigning problems, incorporating new techniques to convey difficult concepts. This is what makes teaching work, and it's at the root of what makes excellent teachers excellent teachers. And what I like about it is it's also a lesson to all of us. Those are things that any of us can do. We don't have to be born into excellence. Excellence is something that we earn with our thoughtful reflection about what's working in our classes and what could happen better or different. And Lynn has been a role model of that over the years. I would also like to quote some of the things her students said in the Gores citations. Phrases like, "She set the bar I strive for," "I want to be a teacher like her," that's a great one, and taking her course changed my life. Taking her course changed my life. So let's hear directly from Lynn. Why should these students be in class?
Well, that was quite an introduction. I'm here today not with all the answers, but to talk to you about my thinking process and how I've been working toward getting to a place where I hope my students really find it valuable to come to class. And this is a timely topic because there are certainly those who think, well, maybe we don't need the live lectures anymore. We've got, videotape. We can videotape the lectures. We've got online degrees. We've got MOOCs. We've got interactive e-textbooks. And, a lot of changes over the past few decades. And, it kind of leaves you thinking, well, so what am I doing standing up in front of a group of live people? What can I do that isn't accomplished in these other venues and formats? So to talk about kind of the process I've gone through on this is let me first talk about my first years of teaching. And I'm sure like many of you, my thought was, well, gee, I know how I was taught in college. That must be the right way to teach people. I, being a techie sort of person and going to a lot of STEM lectures, lots and lots of facts imparted to me, lots of math and derivations and theoretical stuff. And the way I typically was taught, the professor was aiming at keeping the very smartest students in the class entertained and interested. And, kind of never mind the students who were struggling. The most important thing was to not bore the smartest and sharpest of the students in the class. Delivered as a monologue, sometimes talking quite quickly, and lots of different signals that there wasn't really time for questions, that there was so much material to cover, and the thought that, well, their delivery was so wonderful that, of course, you wouldn't have any questions. And lots and lots of copying required, whether they used overheads or they used the blackboard. You'd be frantically trying to copy every single thing that they either wrote or said in order to capture the gist of the lecture. And this was kind of the, all-knowing expert approach to teaching that I thought, well, now I'm a professor, that must be what I'm expected to do. But then, after a few years and feeling like, parts of this really aren't working so well, I started taking a more critical look at my experiences in college and remembering some of the stuff that I didn't like so well. And one example of that is read the book, see the movie. There's usually some variation of that, where what is presented in class actually has a lot of similarities or overlap with what you've read in the book. But I had one experience which was even more dramatic. I was in a calculus class where the professor teaching was also using his own textbook. And I would, frantically week after week would copy down all these derivations he wrote on the board. And one day I sat by a different friend than usual, and I noticed my friend had brought the textbook to class. And all he was doing was following along as the professor almost literally line for line reproduced on the blackboard what had been in his textbook. And so this friend of mine hardly had to write at all. He'd just follow along. It was almost like an assigned reading period to read through the book. Once in a great while, he'd make an extra little notation in the book for something that had been said that wasn't in the book, but he didn't write very often. And I looked at him and I thought, gosh, and I've been frantically writing all this stuff for weeks and weeks, and here you are. So the thought is, you know, very much akin to if you read a book, do you want to see the movie? What is there that's going to be different in seeing the live lecture from what you'd get out of actually just sitting down and looking at the textbook? Where I went to college, lots and lots of detailed derivations. And I can remember at times we'd finally arrive at a final equation, and the professor would say, here it is. Here's the final equation. And it was almost like a moment of silence was called for, and we'd all admire the equation. But they'd never tell us anything about, well, and this is what the equation is showing you, or this is what the different terms mean, or this is the behavior of this based on what you see in the equation. It was as if we were all just supposed to know what the equation was showing us. And so I really didn't get much help at developing my scientific or engineering intuition. I relied on the TAs grading my homework to tell me whether I'd gotten it right or wrong. I had no expectation myself, kind of, gee, does this seem right? Am I confident that I've done the right thing? So those are not such good things. But it gets worse. Many of my professors had a real, almost bothered feeling when they came to class. Oh, I got to go lecture. And they just didn't have much enthusiasm for the teaching process. And that was really apparent in the way that they delivered the material. And even if you were thinking, well, you know, I'm going to ask a question, I really want to get the material, most of them weren't really receptive to that. And there'd be stories flying around, you know, don't ever ask Professor such and such a question. He'll just say, well, that's a waste of my time, I'm not going to answer that. Or that's a trivial question, you should already know that. So, you know, a lot of reasons to be very quiet in class and not draw any attention to yourself. So, in teaching, you know, I started out teaching on the blackboard and writing out all the equations just like I'd been told. And then PowerPoint came along. Wow. It seems so much better than board work, right? You can already have the stuff all typed up. You don't have to write it on the board. You know, it feels more modern to the students. You're really with it. If you've got PowerPoint slides, it can be colored, it can be animated. And so you go from being kind of this knowledgeable person delivering information to someone who maybe is kind of entertaining in the way they've got their PowerPoint going. So you might do something like this. Wow. Really cool, right? And even better, with PowerPoint, you can cover much more material. You don't need to waste time writing. Your students don't need to waste time writing. So you're now entertaining, and you're providing this just fire hose of information every single lecture. And you could have animation again, right? And we're done. We'll go on to the next slide. You got all that? So, you know, it's tough. As a professor, you're like, oh, I need to give them as much information as possible. I need to teach them as much stuff as I can. But you can certainly go overboard. And there are drawbacks to PowerPoint. And one of them is that it can be a very passive experience. If you hand out, as your handouts, reprints of your PowerPoint slides, and the students, you know, are just looking at the PowerPoint slides and looking at your lecture, and there's not much going on to engage the students, it becomes a very passive exercise, very easy for them to start checking their cell phones or taking a nap or things like that. And I feel it can also even more so deter questions from students, because they look and they're like, oh, this is how many PowerPoint slides she has left to get through today. She's kind of running out of time. And they won't ask questions. They want to ask because they know that it's so important to you to get through the material. And so I feel it deters questions from students as well, or it can. And worst of all, you know, they can get the PowerPoint slides afterwards, so why should they come to class? They can look at the PowerPoint slides on their own. They don't need to be sitting in class to look at the PowerPoint slides. And this comes from my son. No matter how glitzy you make your PowerPoint slides and you think, wow, I'm being so entertaining and so with it, you're just not going to be as good as a cat video on YouTube, right? It's just not going to have the same entertainment value. So I think it's not such a good idea to approach teaching from the standpoint of how entertaining can I be for the students, because the vast majority of us are never going to measure up. We're not cut out to be comedians or actors. We're teachers. So why should they come to class? Certainly there's a fair number of instructors who use PowerPoint that have encountered the problem of fewer and fewer students coming to class. And some of them have come up with clever ideas to make sure those students come to class anyway, requiring homework to be handed in, giving unannounced quizzes that count toward the grade so that the student has to come to each class so that they don't miss a quiz. You can even take attendance and have attendance be part of your grade to kind of force the students to come to class. I don't like that idea so well. I have to admit, for some years I tried a variation of this, which was during the first 3 minutes of class or so, I'd give what I called helpful homework hints, kind of help in getting started on the homework set, and telling them things that either you should get an answer like this, or this is what your first steps should look like, or this is where you should find the information you can do the homework problem on. And it's great to give homework hints in class, but I was always uncomfortable with the thought that I was shoving them to attend and to show up on time by offering these homework hints. So my goal over quite a few years now, as my lectures have evolved, is to try to convince the students that there's some real value to attending the lectures. Now in doing this, what I did not want to do is throw out everything I'd ever written in the way of a lecture and start completely over. That is so daunting. And hardly any of us have time to do that massive change all at once. And so my thinking process here has been more, how can I gradually change and modify things to work toward this goal rather than trying to leap all at once to it. So I have classes where I teach using the Blackboard, but for a period of time for one of my classes, the class was also being broadcast to Singapore, and so it was essential that I have something very easy to read, like PowerPoint slides, so that it could be seen far away in another country. And so I wrestled with the thought of, can you make PowerPoint slides be less passive, be more of an interactive experience? And my first thought was, well, gee, I'll just give them everything. They don't need to write down anything. They can just listen to my pearls of wisdom about the material, and it's all, spelled out very nicely in the PowerPoint slide. And what I found is this was very sleep-inducing. The students just weren't engaged. They, kind of maybe followed along, maybe not. So then I got this fantastic idea, and I was so sure it was going to work that I had students spend all summer modifying my PowerPoint slides. And what I tried then is, this is what the students would get in their handout. And the thought was that they would have to fill in some material. Sounds great. The problem was the way I showed them what material to hand in, or to fill in, excuse me, was I'd click and some additional text would show up in red. Still seems okay, doesn't it? Click again, more information shows up. I swear to you, no matter how hard I pushed, I would be back at this stage, and I would say, okay, let's talk about what this parameter is influenced by. The first thing you should write down is blah, 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 blah. The second thing is blah, blah, blah. Third thing is blah, blah, blah. No pencil action whatsoever. They were all waiting for the red text to show up. And then they would write madly. And of course, there were a number of them that asked me, oh, hey, can I get the version of the PowerPoint slide that already has everything filled in? So I thought this was a fabulous idea, and it did not work at all. In fact, it slowed things down more, because then when I'd want to go on to the next slide, they're like, no, we're not done writing yet, because they wouldn't start writing until the red text would show up. So what I now do for when there's a need to use PowerPoint slides or it's appropriate is this is what I give them. This is all I have on the board. And then what I do is I actually, hang on a second. Oops, wrong one. Is I actually write on the slide. Oop, didn't get it yet. Coloring, yeah. So I will write in class on the slide. And since the screen is up right now, I don't write so well. This also has the advantage, so number one, they see me logicking it out, if it's something like an equation. But number two, for stuff like this, then it is so easy to ask them, what do you think? What do you think we should list here as factors that could be influential? And they'll say something, and I'll write it down in their words. And then I'll ask them, well, what else? What else do you think might be important? And so it's a way, this structure then is a way to more engage them and to make them feel like, oh, hey, she actually wrote down what I said. And I actually thought about what could this be influenced by. So much more helpful. My handwriting isn't the best, and so at times I've got to be a little careful. But this gets them to at least be writing some things and also be more engaged. And another advantage I see to this is that when I have really complicated equations, there isn't the fear that they're somehow going to mistranscribe something that's written down. I can go ahead and give the big equation on the PowerPoint slide with having made sure that everything is exactly right, and then go ahead and talk about it in class. But they don't have to worry, oh, did I write that down right? You know, which variable is that she wrote?
Lynn?
Yes?
How long do you think you've had to practice take you to learn to write okay on a tablet?
I didn't do this here. Let me do it right now. I was just worried about. I've got a computer, and the next time I buy something, I'll buy a tablet. Let's see if I can turn it around here. So, I mean, it doesn't look so bad. Because the stylus I've got has a fairly thin point. And so it looks pretty good. And at least I haven't had students complain, what is that? You're writing too small.
You didn't have to practice for months or anything.
There was a little bit of practice or adjusting with the PowerPoint slides on kind of like, ooh, I didn't leave enough room for how much stuff I wanted to do. I need to leave a space under here if I want to talk about units and have the students logic through what units Flux should have. But yeah, it's fiddling, and after a year or two, it tends to be in pretty good shape. Are there other questions? Oh, sorry. There. Okay, hang on. I may need to turn back around. All right. Well, hang on. Let me end, keep, restart. Ah, it's gone narrow. I wrecked it. Well, it's still readable. It just isn't as pretty. So anyway, this is my style when I need to use PowerPoint slides to try to have it be a less passive experience for the students. What else do I do? It's kind of a process that where every year I'm trying to do something to both get new ideas on what I might want to try in lecture, and also to try new things in lecture. And some of these, if you're here, you know about CTL, you know about the fact they've got some great teaching workshops, and There are opportunities both there and just meeting your colleagues to talk about different teaching ideas and how things have worked. There's another thing I do that I don't know that CTL has mentioned. For some of the bigger classes, you dress a little scuzzy and you sneak into the back row. And you can see what the lecturing styles are of some of your colleagues. I found this sometimes very helpful and sometimes very depressing. And that's because we all have our different styles. So, for example, I went to see the lecture of one colleague, and it turned out he was just fabulous at telling jokes. Every one of his lectures had, a number of really funny jokes, and he delivered them very well. And I was so depressed because I'm not a joke teller. And I looked and I'm like, oh, I can never do that. I can never manage to tell jokes the way he does. But, still, there are ideas you can steal and things you can see that will influence how you might want to adjust your own teaching. The other thing I found that is really, really helpful is to use my office hours in ways besides just answering straight questions from the students. And so one thing I do is I keep track of what has confused them or what misunderstandings they've had about the material, and that lets me reflect back on, how can I explain this better, or what misconception do I need to directly address in class that the students are having. The other way I like it is you can test some really unconventional approaches. If a student doesn't understand something, you're like, okay, bear with me, I want to try something with you. And you try explaining it in an unconventional way and see whether it clicks or not. And if it clicks, then you're like, maybe I want to try that with the entire class. Maybe that's something that will be memorable or unusual enough that it will really work for them in understanding the material. So where am I right now as of this year? And again, not claiming I'm close to done, but I've got a lot more student participation in my classes, opportunities to engage them. I have probably at least twice a week, I do small group problem solving exercises where you pose something to the students and have them work together in groups of 2, groups of 3, groups or whatever to try to figure out what the answer is or what's going on. What I'd say about the small group problem solving is it takes some work to figure out what type of question is going to be appropriate. You can ask a question that's way too easy, and they all get together and are like, well, yeah, that's the answer, obviously. And then you're not really getting them learning as part of the group discussion. You can also ask questions that are way too hard, where they're just like, I have no idea. Or questions that take way too long to figure out because you only want to devote a minute or two to this group problem-solving exercise. What I'll say to you is stick with it. Keep experimenting, and you'll figure out after a while that there's certain types of questions that work quite well. And it's wonderful for, I'm sure this has never happened to any of you, but to me, you can just feel the whole class is getting sleepier and tireder. Maybe they've just come from someone else's midterm and they're just completely thwacked out already. And you're thinking, God, I got to do something to wake them back up. What am I going to do? A group problem-solving exercise is usually an awesome way to kind of get them re-energized and re-engaged in the material. I spend a lot more of my class time talking about how to interpret equations, how to look at plots and see how they behave, how to intuitively predict what is going to happen or how something is going to happen based on general principles. And again, the thought here is that this is something they couldn't get from a textbook. And so I'm hoping it helps them feel stronger and more comfortable with the material. As I mentioned, I spend a lot of time saying, hey, this is something I found very confusing, or a lot of students have a hard time with this, to kind of alert them that now I'm going to try to help you really get it, really understand what the right way to look at something and how not to be confused about it. And again, this is something that I hope goes beyond what they would get in their textbook. Big deal, big font. Welcome, invite, questions. This is tricky. You can't start doing this in the middle of the quarter. By the end of the first week, you have established a tone in your class for what kind of class it's going to be and how much or little interaction there is. And it seems like much beyond the first week, you can't, it's really hard to change that tone. And so my rule of thumb is I almost always, the very first class, have something where the students need to participate and give me feedback. I try to pick something pretty easy. I'll often do some kind of list. Oh, you know, what factors do you think might be important here? Or what do you think are variables that would influence this or that? So something where it feels kind of safe for the students to answer. But the other thing that's really important is you can't chicken out. You'll be up there and no one's raising their hand. And you so want to be like, oh, okay, well, let me tell you what you should have listed or what you should have suggested. And if you do that, you've established yourself with the students as someone who asks rhetorical questions, who doesn't really want the students to answer. So you need to wait. A couple times I've even pulled up a chair and sat down and said, well, I'll wait for you. More often, if I can't get them to volunteer individually, I'm like, okay, you know, I'm going to put you into groups of 3 or 4. Each group has to come up with one thing to put on the list. But it's a tone you establish. And the reason I know it doesn't work well beyond the first week is when you're at a really important conference to go to. That was the first week of the quarter, so I had a substitute lecture, and then I came in the second week trying to get the class dynamic more the way I wanted, and it was an utter failure. I could just never get those students after the first week to be more engaged with me. I'm wondering if maybe they were a little pissed at me for having not been with them the first week. I don't know about that, but it's emphasized to me the importance of being there the very first lecture and setting your own tone for how you want the class dynamic to be. I'm a big believer in unconventional or memorable explanations. And the way I came to realize how valuable this was is I take my advisees to lunch at the faculty club once or twice a year. And one year I'd taken a bunch of advisees and they spotted Reggie Mitchell across the room, who teaches thermodynamics. And for those of you who don't know Reggie Mitchell, he is one of the most dignified people I know. Just very proper, appropriately dressed, all that kind of stuff. So they spot Reggie Mitchell across the room, and 3 of them break into this chant, a chant with hand motions. And they all chant this with the hand motions. I think it was maybe the second law of thermodynamics or something like that. It was some kind of a chant. And I was like, what's that? And they're like, oh, well, that's what, you know, Professor Mitchell did in class to help us remember blah, 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 blah. I'm like, oh, well, you're currently taking his class then? And they're like, oh, no, that was last year. That was 2 years ago we took the class. And then, oh, I was so envious. I'm like, they still remember something from a class they took a year ago? And so I realized if someone as dignified and proper as Reggie Mitchell could be willing to get up in front of class and teach them a chant with hand motions to remember an important concept, that I should be willing to try some unconventional things in class and to take some risks in how, what I tried delivering to the students. And, the overall goal here is to help the students really get the material and to communicate that to them, that you really are cheering for them. You want them to understand. You will help them understand what the big deal things are. This has also influenced how I write exams, what I test in exams. I tell students that in engineering, the biggest hurdle is knowing how to set up or start a problem. What are the appropriate considerations or factors or equations to start out with? But that means then in both the homework sets and on the exams that the biggest chunk of points should be for showing they know how to start. Not necessarily for getting the right answer, but for showing they have the right idea on how to start a problem. I also try to test their engineering intuition. How will this system behave? Why are these trends different in this particular plot? And have them tell me in words what's going on. Now, for someone who's an engineering professor, it's so easy to grade problems that have quantitative answers. Reading through the essay answers does take a lot more time, but boy, you learn a lot about the student's level of understanding and whether they really get what you were trying to teach them or not. And showing them plots or equations with not the question like, oh, draw in for this third case how the line would behave, or tell me why this first goes up and then goes down, or tell me what the different parts of the equation are representing. So this is all kind of having what you make a big deal about in class match what you're going to test them on. I never asked students to memorize. That was one of my biggest tortures as a student. I'm a crummy memorizer. I'm just not very good at memorizing. And it's so easy to look things up. Why would you ask someone to memorize something that they can look up in 15 seconds? So I never ask students to memorize things. What I do instead is I say, I will give you whatever you need, the equation or the plot. But I've found that it freaks students out to think, how am I going to find the material in my notes? Or, gosh, she's saying I can't bring my notes. This is a closed book exam. Now I'm really, really fearful. And so what I do for exams that are closed class materials, besides telling the students you won't be asked to memorize, here's last year's exam, you can see that I gave them all the information they needed, is I tell the students, hey, you can bring a cheat sheet. And this makes them feel more comfortable, but it also seems to help them study better, because they have to decide, does this belong on the cheat sheet? Is this important enough to write down on my cheat sheet? Now, the vast majority of students, if I ask them afterward, did you use your cheat sheet? How often did you use it? They'll tell me things like, oh yeah, I remembered it was backside, lower left corner. And then instead of looking it up, they say, and it said. And so the process of making the cheat sheet has helped them get more comfortable with the material. All right. I definitely want to leave time for some questions, but I want to give you a few examples of some of the more unconventional things that I first tested out in the privacy of my office with one student and then decided it worked well enough to try it in class, and then decided it worked well enough in class to keep. First example, Halloween candy. You may think, I know where this is going. She's feeding the students. Yes, the students eventually eat the Halloween candy, but that's not why I bring it. I bring it to illustrate some important principles in chemical reactions. So each of the pieces of candy serves as molecules involved in reactions, and I will show them things like how fast or slow reactions happen, what is it meant by the rate limiting step in a series of reactions, and what happens when one of the reagents is limiting, all with Halloween candy. I usually get a TA to come in. I'm always the slow rate limiting step, and I have the TA go really, really fast. But the problem is the TA needs me to put something into his or her pile before he or she can go on the next step. And thus the students see that I'm the rate limiting step and that my TA can't go fast because of the fact that I'm limiting the supply of reagents. And then to further highlight kind of the rate limiting reagent, I then have the TA say, okay, you're now going to have two different molecules react with each other, but one of the molecules needs to be a yellow candy. And I've purposefully only put 3 or 4 yellow candies in the entire basket. And so this, first I let them go really fast, and then I say, okay, now one needs to be a yellow candy, and they see the TA digging for the yellow candy. And then they realize that kind of like, oh, it doesn't matter how fast the reaction could go if you're limited by one reagent. So that's a weird thing I do with Halloween candy that seems to be very memorable and helps students really get some of these important principles in chemical reactions. What else? The truck versus the bee. I teach about airborne particles. And the way the particles interact with the air, the fluid they're in, depends a great deal on whether they're larger or smaller size particles. And I described this for many, many years to the students. They never seem to remember it very well or really get. Some of them got it, but I wanted everyone in the class to get what the difference was. And so I finally tried, again, first with a student in my office, and I now do it in the whole class, kind of how can you describe it in terms you might understand? And so I say, well, imagine there's this huge swarm of mosquitoes, and you are watching larger objects pass through the swarm of mosquitoes. If you're a Mack truck and you're driving through a swarm of mosquitoes, it has no impact on your travel, right? You continue to go very, very fast. It's not going to slow you down. It's not going to change your direction of motion. And I connect that with how big particles behave in the atmosphere. And then I say, now suppose you're a bee flying through the swarm of mosquitoes. You're going to run into a mosquito once in a while. Now that's going to affect your motion. You're going to rebound a little. You may end up zigzagging a little. And then I connect that with how it's much more like how a very small particle interacts with air as a fluid. And it was really cool this year on the midterm. I saw one student write, oh, well, this is like the Mack truck. This is a big particle. And then, went on with their answer. And I was like, yes, yes. Because the important thing was they remembered. They remembered that there was a difference. What else have I got? Wading through maple syrup. All the students I get in my techie classes have heard of the Reynolds number. But I find that very few of them really understand what the Reynolds number is representing. They can look up or even memorize the equation, but they don't really know what we're talking about. And so instead of talking about air as a fluid, I say, well, imagine it's me and I'm trying to move through a vat of maple syrup. And then I talk about the different levels of effort I have to make to unstick the maple syrup molecules from each other versus part it so I can occupy the space. And I then connect that with the Reynolds number and what assumptions we're making about the Reynolds number in this particular class. And again, it seems to help. A lot more of them afterward are like, oh, well, that's because we're neglecting this and saying it's mostly that. Last thing. The equation whisperer. You've all heard of the horse whisperer, I think it is? Yeah. So it's, after a while, this isn't going to be a good joke anymore, but right now it still connects with the students. I use this in the undergraduate class I teach winter quarter that has a lot of writing and solving differential equations involved. And I work a lot at kind of making connections between how the graph looks, what the equation looks like, and what they might imagine physically happening in the room. But what I found is most students aren't really comfortable looking at an equation and saying, oh, this is why this part of the equation looks this way, and the other part looks that way, and this is what it's telling you about the behavior. And so the joke I make, I'll be like, okay, everyone be quiet. You may not know it, but the equation is whispering to you. And everybody kind of laughs nervously. I say, okay, I'm gonna help you hear what the equation is saying to you. And I, many times over the course of the quarter, say, okay, here's this part of the equation, and this is what it's doing, and it's this part of the plot, and here's the other part of the equation, and yes, that's the way it should look because this is what's being represented. And it's meant to try to encourage them to start being intuitive or interpretive about how equations look. And also the very important skill of deciding, does this equation look right? And I tell them, hey, out in the real world, you're not going to have this TA telling you whether you got the answer right or not. So you have to start developing your own ways of judging, does this answer seem right or not? Does this number I've gotten seem right or not? And that is it. I wanted to give credit that all the animation you saw in these slides was done by my son back when he was 9. At age 9, he was already a much, much better animator than I will ever be in PowerPoint. But remember, he's also the one that told me, hey, you're never going to compete with you two, focus. And from that, I took focus on doing a good job helping students understand things. Don't try so hard to entertain them.
So we definitely have time for some questions.
Yes?
What do you do about the quiet students, the people who come from background where you don't raise your hand, you don't participate in discussions? How do you encourage them to get them into it?
The only way I've found to do that, because it's cultural, right?
Yeah.
Some of it, and yeah, if you're naturally shy, you and I can't talk them out of that. I do that in groups, and I do it by at times assigning a spokesperson. And the way I assign a spokesperson, I don't say, oh, pick the quietest person in your group, and that's going to be the spokesperson. I do silly things like, okay, whose ever birthday was the closest to today is going to do it. Whichever person in your group is the shortest, that person is going to do it. Whichever person's home is the farthest away from Stanford or the closest to Stanford is going to do it. And I try to think of kind of a variety of things. And my hope is by randomness that sometimes the spokesperson becomes that really quiet person, and that they also need to learn how to express what their group found. Yeah.
You started talking about your old professors always wanting to entertain the smart kids, but you, I think of everyone, right? And you try to make things easy to understand. Have you ever had complaints from the smart kids saying it's too easy?
No. I mean, it's once in a while, you can usually tell who the smart kids are after a while. And, if they express any kind of, oh, that's not such a good assumption, aren't you missing this or that? I'll either chat with them after class, or if they come in office hours, I'll layer on a little extra kind of, oh, you may realize that this is only an appropriate assumption in this case, and we're kind of glossing over what happens in these other cases. Let me tell you a little more about it. So no, I haven't had that. And in my undergrad class, which is definitely aimed at undergrads, I get quite a few graduate students taking it. So you'd think among them might be some complainers. But the other thing to tell you, you're never going to make all the students happy. So don't have your heart broken because one student is saying to you, oh, this is so easy, why aren't you giving me more depth or more substance? You're really you're aiming for trying to benefit a whole bunch of the students, but you're never going to keep them all 100% happy. Yeah, Michelle.
A lot of what you've been talking about are issues that come up for faculty as they think about massive open online courses or flipped classrooms. Definitely, if they're having students watch lectures online outside of class, then it raises the question of what to do in class.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, it sounds like you've already done a lot of the thinking that would allow you to flip successfully. Are you tempted to do that?
I hate being videotaped, so that's a big hurdle. And I have concerns that, well, I could videotape parts of my class and have them be useful for a few years, but there's other parts of the class that change every year, so it would end up having to be an annual set of videotaping to really be useful. But yes, I've thought about it, and I've hesitated at the amount of videotaping involved. And yeah, I just, videotaping, I don't know if any of you have ever heard this, but when the students watch the videotape, if they want, they can watch it at, I think it's 1.3 times. And you know, and apparently almost all of them do. They're like, speed it up, get through it more quickly. And you know, perhaps that's a reflection that when we lecture a bit slowly. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I worry about how much they're truly capturing when they're going at 1.3 times and maybe watching 2 or 3 weeks worth of lectures in one sitting at times. I think there's some challenges in flipping a class, definitely. But yeah, I'm thinking about it, Michelle. Yeah.
Actually, in a similar vein, if you were to think about your ideal classroom setting, no cost issues involved, what piece of technology or change or whatever would you ideally like to have? Like every wall being a screen, what kind of things?
I think of a couple things. I've never used clickers, but I've thought about if I ever used clickers, it wouldn't be for their design purpose as much as asking people to click whenever they're the least bit confused by something to kind of get immediate feedback on that. For students who are undergrads, it's a piece of cake. You can tell the boredom or loss on their face right away. But what I find by the time students are graduate students, they've got a better poker face, most of them, and you're not getting the same level of feedback on kind of, is this making total sense, or are you now completely lost? So that's one thought that comes to mind. I do think there's great value to working examples, in class as well as on homework sets. And I know there's classes at Stanford who have tried this thought of having groups of students work on solving problems together. I think for that there's some bumps to be ironed out in terms of kind of figuring out, do they even know how to start? Are they heading off on the wrong path? How quickly can you notice whether they're doing the appropriate steps and gaining the appropriate understanding or not? So yeah, that can be tricky. Students get lost at all different kinds of levels. Yeah?
I like your truck and bee.
You like my truck and bee, okay.
The eliciting the students to imagine, like you're trying to improve their intuition about these foods, is the basic, effect of a story. So you can tell a story about, we didn't used to realize the size of the bar. You can do it by telling the history of your discipline. Or you can make more elaborate, with more concrete details, metaphors, right? Which is basically what the truck and the bee are.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what role, because writing is a way of slowing down the reception.
Yeah.
Or even doing group work. And 2 times or 1.3 is a way of speeding it up. Like, how would you slow it down productively so by the time the students are trying to answer a question on the screen, they've already molded enough that they've imagined possible answers?
That could be tricky. In one class, I did it accidentally one time. And that was that I had handed out a homework set that was very open-ended. And it involved, I gave them each 2 cigarettes. Charged the department class money for purchasing the packs of cigarettes. And the goal was for them to assess how much difference the filter tip made. So one cigarette had a filter tip and the other did not. Interestingly, one time I handed it out, and because of how the quarter had gone and my, to what extent I had or had not stayed in sync with where I'd planned, that very day was the day that I was lecturing on filters. And so they saw the homework set first, and then started watching the lecture. And the level of engagement was just so much better than average. And I'm sure it was out of the very, kind of, oh my gosh, I got to do this homework set, so I need to understand what she's talking about right now to do that. But it can be tricky in a more general level to do that. The other thing I do is I'll have kind of recurring stories. One of them involves a mythical eating and drinking establishment called Smokey's Bar and Grill. A place that caters to smokers, and they all smoke 2-3 packs a day and do so inside, and we assess formaldehyde levels and whether the servers get eye irritation and things like that. But it's a problem we revisit several times. And so I can kind of foreshadow when we're going to revisit it and kind of say, oh gee, the next thing we're going to wonder about with respect to Smokey's Bar and Grill is this. We need to learn a little more about this, and then we'll come back and assess what's going on for this particular system or situation again. And that seems to help somewhat because they're then primed knowing that I'm going to come back and revisit it.
Time for maybe one more question?
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I just was wondering if you've noticed any differences in gender in terms of how you develop your teaching methods. I mean, I'm such a humanities female type. Anything you do up there, I look at that, it's just like an absolute foreign language. And I know you must have some female undergraduates that might be perceiving information differently, and if that affects how you present it.
I mean, to make horrible stereotypes, the women tend to do better on the descriptive answers and sometimes show less confidence with the mathematical stuff, with lots and lots of exceptions, of course. But my hope there would be that me standing up in front of the room saying, oh, this is such cool math, let's go ahead and do it, and convincing them that yes, it can make sense to them would help a bit with if they have math anxiety. I would say I notice much more difference between students from North America, say, versus students from Asia in terms of a whole array of things. How much they participate in class, how receptive they are to some of these less conventional examples, what they do and don't do well on exams. So yeah, we're always teaching to this array of students.
Speaking of teaching to an array of students, this professor has a class full of students.
No, they've got 15
Almost.
minutes.
They got 15 minutes to go. But thank you, Lynn, for the time today. A little bit more time.